All right, why don't we we'll kick it off, and folks will, I'm sure, be joining. Appreciate everyone being here today. This is going to go with the disclosures first. This is an open public event. We're not providing any strategic advice to anyone who happens to be working on a campaign. I don't believe, as far as I know, from what I can tell from the signups, that anyone is directly working on any federal campaigns, but if you happen to be in that case, please do not pose any questions in the chat. Nothing we say here should be construed as financial advice based on your future earnings or anything like that. So with that in mind, going to do a quick round of introductions to fellow presenters, and then we will dive on into the conversation. And I should also say there you should see a Q&A function in the activities box, which is the triangle, square, circle, sort of to the bottom of the right. You can put questions in there, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. We also got some questions ahead of time on the sign-up forms, and we will be using those throughout the discussion as well. So again, really appreciate you all being here. So kicking off, introduce Sam Nelson-Moss, who is our Director of Client Success at Trendency, who is going to be leading the discussion today. And then also joining us is Andrew Abramson, who is an analyst here, and he'll be chatting through some of the congressional results and data that we have. Excellent. All right. Thanks for joining us. And the last thing I'll say before we dive in is, like, look, on the presidential level, everything's close, right? Every state poll says it's close. There's no information out there that makes that different. But what we're doing at Trendency and the way that we're asking questions is we're doing this a little bit differently than your traditional research. So instead of just binary choices between two candidates, are you voting for Harris or are you voting for Trump, we're allowing our participants to allocate their views, allocate their answers. So, what % chance is there that you'd vote for Harris? What % chance you vote for Trump? So we're measuring not just the support for each candidate, but how that strength of support for each candidate is shifting over time. So when you see a lot of our numbers, it's not necessarily equivalent to a straight up horse race that you would see in a traditional poll, but we're measuring sort of the average level of support. So, you'll see some numbers that are probably a little different than what you see in the public realm, but we're giving that the overall context and understanding of, how voters are feeling about the candidates and in which direction things are headed. So with that all being said, I will kick it over to Sam to get the conversation going.
Great, thank you. And welcome everyone. Really excited to have everybody here. I know a couple of people are joining in even just in the last couple of seconds. So I just want to recap what Stefan just talked about. So today we're going to be talking about the state of the race leading up to Election Day. November 5th is only a couple of weeks away, so we're closing in, and early voting is in full swing. So with that in mind, the Trendency team wanted to get together and take a look at the data from the last 6 months that we've been looking at and share that out and kind of look backwards in order to kind of, put some puzzle pieces together about what might happen on November 5th. Stefan will also go through like the Trendency methodology information as we're looking at these charts. They're a little different than what you might expect or what you've seen with traditional public opinion research. So we'll do our best to kind of highlight that with each chart. And then before we get really started looking at the data, just a couple of housekeeping items. So the chat is closed for today just to keep it easy and light, but the Q&A is open. You'll find that on the lower right-hand part of your screen. It's the icon with like the triangle, square, circle. You click on that and you can click on through to the Q&A. You're welcome to submit questions with your name tied to it. You're also welcome to submit questions anonymously. That's fine too. We'll do our best to answer questions as they come in, but we've also got some time reserved at the end to answer any questions that are still remaining or pop up later on. And then also, just so everyone knows, the session's being recorded and we'll be sharing it shortly after we wrap up here. Okay, so with that, you want to kick it off and share the presentation, Stefan?
Let's go. All right.
Great. So let's kick off and dive into the national numbers. Stefan, how would you characterize the race for the White House this year?
Interesting. Obviously, we went kind of from, I'll call it boring-ish in the beginning of the year, since it was looking like just a complete rematch of what we saw in 2020. This summer was a summer for the ages. Obviously, we had and then first assassination attempt of Trump. Then we had the shall we call it the debate debacle for Biden. Then Biden dropping out, Harris becoming the likely nominee, and and then we moved into Harris being the nominee, and then what we've had over the last probably I would say since the debate of sort of a mostly static situation. So as we're coming into that sort of the turmoil of July, it was sort of looking, I'll say, similar to what we saw in 2020 with Biden having a slight advantage in that average allocation. The debate happened. You can kind of see that right here. His support dropped very quickly. And then, once he dropped out, Harris took over towards the end of July, rocketed up pretty quickly, was moving in a positive direction. Sort of, I'll call it like mid-August-ish is when she passed Trump, and then moved up from there. And then the last bump up we saw was post-debate. And then, like I said, it's been pretty flat and neutral since then, with a little bit of movement happening over the last few weeks. And these are national numbers. So when we're looking at these, we see Harris with a 4-point advantage on the average allocation, and putting her in a good position to win the national vote, which we all know doesn't mean a ton, but certainly is telling on how things are going in other areas.
Got it. And obviously the big story for the year, or one of the big stories, since it's been a crazy summer and a crazy year in general, is that switch from Biden to Harris as the Democratic nominee. So do you think that was a positive thing for Democrats overall and really changed the state of the race, or do you think there's more nuance to that answer?
Can I say yes to both of those? I think so. Yes. Ultimately ended up being a positive for the Democrats. Biden obviously, even go before the debate, the issue of age, and was front and center. Once the debate happened, it became apparent very quickly that recovering from this was going to be incredibly difficult. And then from a research perspective, what was fascinating / I think definitely is making us think sort of how we ask questions and how we analyze data moving forward is the fact that before Harris became the likely nominee, her support was quite low. So you kind of see this number right here. She was down below 30 in the support, but then like the second she became the nominee, her number just started moving up. Right? Really pointing to the fact that people are very, I don't want to say that they're bad at giving hypotheticals, but they won't respond to hypotheticals in the same way as if it's a concrete decision. So, nothing changed in the first 72 hours about Harris other than that she became the likely nominee. And in that time, we saw her support go up by like 10, 15 points just on the fact that sort of her title changed. And, again, something that we need to be thinking about as an industry as we're moving forward.
Got it. And how are we seeing this translate into different voter groups?
Yeah, so if we look at, and then this is kind of answering the previous question a little bit, but if we're looking at some of the different demographics and the movement, so what we see here, Biden in green, Harris in blue, and the movement, and this is Biden in right in the middle of July compared to Harris in the middle of October. And where we're seeing that movement. So, where you see some of the biggest growth in terms of support, Latino and Latina voters, going from below 30 up into mid 40s for Hispanic and Latino, Hispanic men, and then Latina Hispanic women, getting up close to 50, where again was below 30 for Biden. Now, slightly obviously different time periods, but I think, certainly an interesting comparison to look at that. We're also seeing growth from, every group, right? Some decent growth among white men, different age groups, definitely seeing a big increase in support among younger voters who had, at least in our research, public research, sort of the biggest issue with Biden's age. And then, Black women jumped up a ton, and that was Biden's strongest group, and now is by far, in a way, Harris's strongest group, and some slight growth among Black men as well. And then if we look at how that compares currently, Trump and Harris, now both of these are October 15th numbers that, the difference among Black women is massive. Latina voters, also a big difference there. Black men seeing a pretty decent gap, but obviously Black men, Black women, different levels of support for Harris overall on the average. Interestingly, 75 plus voters have a pretty solid advantage for Harris. Younger voters is less so, and then a lot of that is gender-based. White women, pretty decent gap. Right, we have Trump currently having a higher average level of support among Latino, Hispanic men, and then also among white men, Trump also has the advantage. So those are the two groups where we're seeing Trump with an advantage. And again, this is nationally, and everything else, Harris has an advantage to various degrees.
Got it. So when we're looking at these groups, and we're looking at the averages, which means the average number of points out of 100 that someone's allocating to either answer option, I see we're seeing a lot of high 30s to low 50s, so somewhere in the middle. So this ties in with a question that was submitted by someone during registration for today's event. Does either candidate have the enthusiasm advantage?
It's sort of, I'll call it tough to call it an advantage, but I think sort of different motivations, right? And so, I mean, we kind of know just anecdotally that, Trump supporters are very fervent about their support for his candidacy. We know that, we've seen that has really not changed much over time. So, and now getting into sort of the numbers behind the averages, right? So, averages can sometimes hide things, right? So if your average is close to 50, it either can be everyone's hovering in that sort of middle spot, or everyone's at 100 and 0. And, if we average 100 and 0, it gets you to 50, and which is pretty much the case of what we're dealing with in this election. And again, probably not shocking that this is the case, just given our political rhetoric these days, where our politics really is. But, giving a slight nod to Harris in that, she has a slightly higher 39% of voters say there's an 80 to 100% chance that they're going to vote for her, compared to 35. Not a huge advantage, but a slight advantage there. Then on the negative side, right? So now we're getting into the motivation for your vote. So, you can vote for someone, or you can vote against someone, or it can be a little bit of both. And, what we see, and again, nationally, is that Harris has a lower number at the lower percent chance, at 0 to 19. So, there are less voters completely ruling out voting for her. Now, it's 47% of voters say that there's little to no chance that they would vote for her, but that is a smaller number than where Trump is right now, which is at 52% of voters saying there's just about no chance. And, very telling is just how few people are in this middle section. Trump has a 1-point advantage when it comes to the strong leans. They're completely even on the toss-up. 5% of voters are in that like kind of giving 50-50-ish to both candidates. And then Harris has a slightly higher number at this lower level. Now, in 2020, if someone gave a 30% chance of voting for Trump or more, there was almost not 100% guaranteed, but it was very likely that they were ultimately going to end up voting for Trump. So, and we don't know exactly how that's going to play out this year, just given the fact that we have different candidates and different things going on. But, you have to sort of, when you're looking at these numbers, it's like, look, it's likely that Trump will pick up that 1 point extra of this 60 to 79 group. And then, this can split either way, a little bit more advantage here. But if, it's like 1 or 2 more points for Trump, kind of likely going in his direction, like maybe 1 point to Harris. And then, we're kind of looking at Harris with a 2-point advantage overall nationally, again, in that average allocation.
Got it. Yeah. And then very, very few people in those middle categories.
Right.
So I know, and you mentioned it's hard to tie back to previous elections because this is just a completely different situation. But we definitely get callbacks to both 2016 and 2020. So how does this data compare to 4 years ago?
Yeah. So, and then, again, with our different approach. So, we bring in voters nationally and we're engaging with them over time. So they're logging in, typically it's about once a week, a little bit less, answering a short set of questions, 8 to 10 questions. So we're talking to the same people, right? So when we're looking at movement, it's not the broader, are men moving, are women moving? Is Joe moving, or is Jane moving? And then we're taking all of Joe's and Jane's and people in the same, using their data to understand how the groups as a whole are shifting, right? So when we're measuring movement, it's about actual individuals and how they're moving. But then we also have the ability to go backwards in time. And we've been running some of these panels going back to 2017. So we have voters and participants that we have data from 2020, and then we can look at sort of how things have shifted. So you kind of see, Trump 2020 is the top line here, the sort of the maroon. Biden, when he was the candidate, is in the purple. Here comes Harris in the blue. So you can kind of see, Trump is consistently running behind where he was at these various points. It's slightly different because the election day isn't on exactly the same day, but we're within a day or two, so pretty consistent. And so there's something as in everything with the data, you can take, depending on who you're supporting, right? Like you can take positives and negatives away from this. So the positive for Trump is currently, when we're looking at the October 15th, he's running ahead of where he was in 2020. And also in the plus column for Trump is that Harris is running behind where Biden was at this point. So that that looking a little tighter. Now at the same time, Harris has the advantage overall, and definitely put that in the plus side for her column. But so it's a little bit different. Now when we look at the same voters who in 2020, how they're voting now. So again, these are all the people that we have from our national panel who have been with us for at least 4 years or more, and we have something north of like 40,000 active users. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head of how many were in this 2020 category, but talking about a large number of voters. And so you can kind of see, right, like there's almost no movement, no real difference. If we look at sort of the consistency, it just doesn't, it just hasn't really shifted, right? So Harris has a slight advantage, 91.96% average allocation from her 2020 support, from Biden's 2020 supporters, I should say. And then Trump's at 91.3. 0.6 is a very small number. I mean, but if you're going to give her give an advantage, I'd give that slightly to Harris. But almost no one is changing who they're voting for based on compared to their 2020 vote. And now if we look at this sort of in a slightly different way of among the people who have been with us since 2020, how are they voting? About a little bit less than 3-point advantage for Harris compared to Trump. So we're seeing no major dynamic shifts in 2024 compared to 2020 among the voters who participated in 2020.
Got it. And with things being so consistent, and we're seeing that with the 2020 voters and this year, I feel like enthusiasm is such a big key buzzword with this candidate change. So I want to go back to that. Is there anything in the data that can add to this?
I mean, I think it's so there are a couple other ways that we look at the numbers, right? So we have that positive motivation and the negative motivation. So the positive we call the commitment index. So like how committed are you to that candidate? And these are the kinds of things where it's like, hey, if it's raining on election day and you're voting in person, how likely are you to stay and go out and vote? Are you going to stand in line, et cetera, right? So it's sort of like how big is that sort of that strong supporter, true believer, whatever you want to put that category in at. So when we're looking at this index, we see that an advantage for Harris back in middle of July. So this is actually Biden commitment, and then it switched over. So Biden was running behind Trump in sort of that truly committed voter. And then ever since, Harris has not only had an advantage, but has been growing that advantage. Now, Trump there's a little bit of movement here, but again, like I said earlier, his supporters are his supporters, whereas, Harris is moving that number, at least nationally, in a positive direction. She's just under 40% are in that commitment index, or what we would consider the truly committed voter, but, so not above 50, but certainly higher than Trump's 35. Now, if we look at the opposite, so again, this is the rejection. So, right, like just completely ruling out voting for the other candidate, where that motivation is really coming from. So the lower the number here, the better. So, we see that Trump had dropped down from July to August. I'm going to put most of that just on the fact that it was now Harris running against Trump versus Biden. And, she's been dropping her rejection index. Again, you want to have as low a number as possible on this. And she's below 50%, 47.75%, rejecting the idea of voting for Harris. Now, again, not zero, not even low digits, but Trump is at 52%. So, if a majority of voters are just completely ruling out the idea that they would support a candidate, it's very hard to imagine how that candidate wins. Now, there was an exception to that in 2016 when a majority said they wouldn't vote for Clinton and they wouldn't vote for Trump, which was a first for us. But, so it's not like, oh, if you're above 52, there's zero chance, no way that you can win. But, both candidates were above. Now, in this case, one candidate's below 50, one's above 50. So it's hard to imagine that Trump can win the national vote. I don't think anyone's really saying that he could win the national vote, but the data is definitely backing that up. And then if we I was going to talk about the difference between, I forgot to put the slide in. So but then so if we put those two numbers together, we definitely see Harris with the advantage and has been growing that advantage in terms of enthusiasm over the last 2 to 3 months.
Got it. And obviously we just saw a little preview there, but I think everybody on the call knows that we don't utilize the national popular vote to elect our presidents. We rely on the Electoral College, and that invariably has led to the creation of key battleground states that we talk about every cycle. So we did want to narrow it down a little bit, since that seems to be a growing group every year, a little bit. So we asked all of you which states you wanted to focus on today, and the winners were Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada. So I think we're going to start up north and talk about Michigan first.
Totally blew the lead on that one. Yeah, so I mean, overall, the states are, noisy is not necessarily the right word to use, but we're seeing some diverging results in the states that we're in. Now, we're not in every single state, or we don't have big enough panels in every state to sort of talk about every single one. But in some states that are, people are not considering toss-up states, Florida, Ohio, we're seeing relatively strong levels of support for Harris. And definitely a rosier landscape for her than what we saw for Biden in 2020 or for Clinton in 2016. And then, in some states, like, when we're looking at Michigan, which, obviously has been close the last couple of elections, it's sort of not following necessarily the same pattern, which I'll say is different, right? Like, typically it's sort of, as Wisconsin, we were seeing similar patterns in like Wisconsin, in the Rust Belt states. So like Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, over the years, we would see similar types of movement. And then same thing with like Nevada, Arizona, and Florida, it's his own thing, but we could kind of put that in with like Georgia, where like patterns were sort of similar, not the same, but similar. And this year we're seeing different things happening in different states, which could point to some interesting results on election day, and maybe some patterns being broken that aren't really following the norm, looking back over the last 4 or 5, 6 presidential elections. But as you see in Michigan, it's been close for a while, going back to the middle of August. Harris has been holding a slight lead in terms of the average allocation, and then her support's been dipping down from early October, and then has sort of plateaued. Trump at the same time was moving up over the first couple of weeks of October, and then dipped back down, and they're in a dead heat as of 2 days ago. So incredibly close on the average allocation. And then if we look at some of these other measurements, we're seeing Trump's commitment moving up, Harris is moving down over the last, and these are just, we're not doing this day by day just to not make the lines go completely crazy, but this is just looking at the mid-month point for what these indexes were on each of these days. But definitely an upswing for Trump over the last month. And then when we're looking at the rejection, same kind of thing, where that idea of not voting for Trump has dropped from about 56% in middle of August, and now that's dropped down to 44. Harris is hovering 52, and then went down to about 50, so it dropped about a point over the last month on that one. And then if we kind of put these two together, which I'll call it like tends to over state sort of the direction of things, but it just kind of gives that idea of like who's heading in a positive direction, who's heading in a negative direction. We definitely see that the last couple of months have been better for Trump than they have been for Harris in Michigan.
So a lot of movement there. What about heading southwest to Arizona?
Yeah, and then just real quick, so one question about the what % of the national vote will be early. I'm going to plead some ignorance on this one, but I saw an article yesterday, maybe this weekend, where apparently in Michigan, the early vote there's about I think it's 1.5 million more early voters in at this point, or expected. Sorry, I'm not remembering the exact phrasing of it, but basically the % of early vote for 2024 is expected to be much higher. And then at least in Michigan, based on the analysis of who's turned in ballots, there's an advantage to Democrats in terms of the early vote there. So I think Democrats could be walking into Election Day with, maybe that's where the 1.5 million is jumping in my mind, with like a 1.5 million voter advantage going into Election Day, and then we'll see what happens on
the voting day. But I won't go too deep into the, but like clearly, like in 2020, Republicans were making a big deal about not early voting. They're trying to walk that back a little bit now, but there's still that idea of early voting is flawed and or corrupt. So therefore, you have to wait until election day, which means, reliance on a solid GOTV effort. Okay, so now I'll actually answer your question. So moving south, again, it's a pretty similar pattern of not massive movements. Now, Trump in our numbers on the average allocation was running ahead of Harris starting in middle of August until about the middle of September. So that was like right around the debate. We saw these numbers cross, and then we see Harris like ticking up a couple times. And now holding a 3-point advantage on the average allocation. And she's been holding that pretty steady since, let's see, about the 26th, so right at the end of September. And then now on the commitments, again, a little bit different than what we're seeing in Michigan, right? So we saw a drop for Harris in terms of that level of commitment from middle of August to middle of September, but now that has rebounded and is starting to move up. Trump's numbers did the opposite, and getting pretty close to each other as we're running into the last 3 weeks of the election. And then if we're looking at the rejection, so again, there's no chance I'm going to vote for this person. Similar, just inversed, where August to mid-September was better for Trump. And then the last, mid-September to mid October, better for Harris. And these are dead even right at this point. A couple tenths lower for Trump than for Harris. And then if we put these numbers together, since we saw the same exact patterns for both, we're seeing the same patterns on that commitment minus rejection. So right now, numbers trending better for Harris in Arizona than for Trump, but they're heading towards stalemate status.
Got it. And how about Nevada? Do you think it's going similarly to Arizona, or is it completely different?
Completely might be strong, but slightly different. And so again, similar in the fact that when we started out in mid-August, Trump had the lead. Then the debate had a big effect on the numbers, and we saw the jump up. Similar to Arizona, that's where we saw the crossover for Harris's support, and now she's stepped that up 2 more times since the debate, and now stands at a 3-point advantage in the average allocation. Now, different in that, instead of that sort of that curve like for Harris and for Trump, right? Like we're seeing a little bit more steady for Trump, August, September, slight uptick in the commitments in the last month, but going from 33.24 to 35, so about a 2-point jump. And then Harris, obviously having a big jump through the end of August, beginning of September, and then has continued that trend. And her commitment is just under 50, right? And again, not to say it couldn't happen, but if over 50% of voters are truly committed to your candidacy, your campaign, it's hard to imagine that you're going to lose. Not impossible, but the odds of it happening definitely go up. And then if we look on the opposite, again, it hasn't been a great last month for Trump in Nevada, where we see his rejection going from just under 50 to getting close to 60%. Is at 58 currently. And then that August to mid-September, a good month for Harris in Nevada, and then the improvements over the last month for her, but just a point change, so nothing radically different. And then if we put the two together, again, this is just meant to magnify. So we now see Harris in positive territory, which again argues that you should be in good shape, right? And also that more voters are voting for you than are voting against your opponent, which typically is where you want to be, that positive motivation versus just complete hatred of the other candidate. Like now a vote's a vote, so most people aren't going to complain regardless of how you get there. But typically we find that, if you're in that positive territory, you're definitely going in with a bigger advantage, more enthusiasm, and less is likely to change over this last period as we get into the election. So just sort of summing up here, just looking at how this looks, right? So nationally, advantages for Harris in each of these categories. So overall average allocation, the commitment to her campaign, also an advantage on that negative measurement. Then therefore, a commitment minus rejection, that's looking better for her. Last five. So, since we're talking to folks throughout time, we're factoring in what they told us in the past in some of the current measurements. But then we also look at it in different ways. So looking at just, okay, the last 5 times you've logged in and answered a question about who you're going to vote for, who's doing better, and then just looking at the last response. So the last response and the last 5 are, take it with a grain of salt, just because especially the last response, like that's not necessarily a balanced subset of the overall panel. But we're just sort of looking at, okay, like what was the last thing you told us? That last time could be at different times, things like that. But again, it's just another piece of the analysis that we look at in terms of like, is there anything to indicate that maybe these overall numbers are not as strong or not as weak as they tend to present themselves? And then also looking at, of people who identify as Democrats or Republicans, are they, whose base is voting at higher levels for them, and then who's getting better crossover. The crossover is very small. Split ticket voters are a dying breed. But nationally, we see a 2-point advantage in the percent of Republicans voting for Harris compared to Democrats voting for Trump. Michigan, even on the overall average, but most of these measurements giving an advantage to Trump, just pointing to, he's walking into election day with a little bit more wind at his back. The only thing that is sort of the caveat on that is we're seeing a 6-point advantage on the base party support for Harris. And, the opposition party support is negligible. It's a 0.4 difference. So about the same there. So overall, more going for Trump in Michigan, but we do have the base party support. So one of the measurements pointing to Harris, and overall a dead heat. Arizona, also a dead heat when we're looking at the sort of that overall average, but then, very little difference what we're seeing there. So, looking at that, it's sort of like what we're kind of reading now, we're kind of expecting to probably see something similar on election day. Michigan, a little bit more questionable on where the numbers can move. And then you see in Nevada, similar to the national numbers, we're looking at advantages for Harris sort of across the board. So, if we're sort of ranking these, it feels like, Nevada feels the safest, not guaranteed, but safest for Harris. Arizona would sort of be in the middle, and then Michigan would be, I'll say, the most questionable, or the least likely to go in either way of these 3 states that we're looking at.
Got it. And obviously, we're talking about 3 battleground states, and there are a couple handful more going on, but definitely an interesting take and a look at the last couple of months of data. Now, one thing we haven't covered yet is the Senate level, congressional level races. I know we had a couple of questions come in about that as part of registration, and we've also got a question in the Q&A asking which party will win the House. So I know we had some data we wanted to share about that. Do we want to flip over to?
Yeah, Andrew, I'll let you share your screen on that one. I'll let him take the prediction question on the House, since that's maybe even tighter than the presidential, and you can You can take that one.
Yeah, if one of you could give me permission to share my screen.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
Oh, there we go.
Try now.
Okay, so yeah, the story with the congressional race is pretty similar. It's the results are really just very close. So if we look at the distribution of opinion, we can see that back in May, when Biden was still at the top of the ticket, a third of voters were pretty much decided on where they were going to vote. So 35% went to Democrats and 37% went to Republicans. And this survey question was just asking about generic congressional candidates. So when survey takers are responding to this, they may be thinking about their own congressman, but they also might just not know who their congressman is and just be thinking about party generally. So it's kind of hard to translate this, but at least nationally, this is where people stood generally back in May. And then now, as we can see, there's really not much change. The Democratic candidate went up by 3% in the 80 to 100 zone, which is the strongest commitment to voting for a candidate. And the Republican generic candidate went down by 1%, which isn't really, I mean, these numbers don't really tell us much about how voters are shifting, but that middle range between 20 to 79 points are really going to be what decides the outcome of the House. And as we know, there's a very slim majority in the House right now for Republicans. So those numbers are really going to impact who takes control in January. And then if we look at the trend lines for the generic Democratic candidate and Republican candidate, we can see that they've pretty much been running equally. So as Sam and Stefan mentioned earlier, we're not, in this case, we weren't asking like, who do you support, the Democrat or the Republican? We're asking survey takers to rate who they support on a scale of 0 to 100. And so the average for the Democratic candidate there was 43 points out of 100, and the average for the Republican candidate has been pretty much the same. Over time, there's been a little bit of fluctuation. So between May and August, we've seen, some shifts between 43 and 44, but nothing that really tells much of a story. But since August, after, of course, Harris became the nominee, after some of the debates, Democrats have picked up steam in the generic congressional race. But I mean, this really will come down to individual districts and how voters feel about a specific candidate, because again, this is still just generic. And then, yeah, if we look at the commitment indexes for the congressional race, we can see that back in May, the generic Republican candidate had more strong committed support, and the Democratic candidate had 2% less. So that's not statistically much, but it's something to show for Republicans back in May. The Republicans really increased their lead among voters into July and early August. And then we can see that back in September, the Democrats took the lead, or at least the generic Democratic candidate did. And now the Republicans are up by 2%. But I mean, this chart is really zoomed in here, so it looks like 2% is a big difference, but it's really it's really a close race.
Got it. So with that in mind, generic race is very tight. The makeup of the House and the Senate are both tight, so the outcome of who's going to be in control of both bodies of Congress is kind of up in the air at this point. We want to go back to Bruce's question in the Q&A. If Republicans win the House, what are your thoughts on whoever is in charge, if it's Mike Johnson or whoever ends up in charge, majority leader, if they cause chaos and SCOTUS has to step in and make a call on the election? What are your thoughts on that?
Not good. And we did, we towards the beginning of the year, we asked, we did ask some questions around what Americans thought was going to happen after the election, since we're dealing with a rematch. And then we asked those questions recently again. And what's, God, I hate using the word interesting, but what scary, I guess, like, so 91% of Americans think that there's a strong possibility that we're going to see violence post-election. One of the biggest differences, and I think arguably the more troubling, is, we saw that among Harris supporters, about 2/3 were expecting violence if Harris wins, whereas only a third would expect violence if Trump wins. For Trump supporters, the numbers are almost identical. It's like 75% expect violence if Harris wins, 55% expect violence if Trump wins. So, given what we're seeing, in the news, things in North Carolina, people going after FEMA officials with guns and things like that, right? So if there's a perception of, regardless of outcome, there's going to be violence among Trump supporters, I think the concern is that it could either be, violence similar to what we saw in 2020 because they're angry that their candidate lost, or what I'm going to refer to as sort of preemptive violence if Trump wins, where if, they're not, and, we're not talking like, millions of Trump supporters are going to try to recreate what happened on January 6th. But if, there are enough folks who believe that Harris voters or supporters are going to come after them, that they're going to take that sort of proactive approach and sort of, the theory behind like the stand your ground laws, where it's like, well, if I think someone's going to attack me, I'm going to attack them first, and that's fine. So I would fully expect, we're not going to know who won the election on election night. Like, that's going to take a while. I'm fully expecting pretty drawn out set of lawsuits, et cetera, potentially making 2020 seem like a walk in the park. And, definitely a high likelihood of bad things happening at some point in time. So back to the question, so if Republicans end up holding the House, and, if they win back the Senate, then I think potentially a higher likelihood of shenanigans, for lack of a better word, chaos, however you want to refer to it. What's interesting, and certainly in the realm of possibility, is that both chambers flip, which I don't think has ever happened, or at least certainly hasn't happened in the last 100 years. Then different dynamic with that happening, but obviously it hasn't been that long since January 6th. So I'm hoping that our better angels prevail, but not putting a ton of money on it.
Right. And if anyone is interested in reading more about our research on how voters kind of view the state of things in terms of election violence post November 5th, I've dropped the link for that in the chat, so you can read more about it there. And then another question that we had, we were looking at generic congressional numbers. Do you think that the Senate races are going to follow similar patterns? Is it that tight? What are your thoughts there?
I think so. And again, we're not tracking every single election and in every single state, but I think what we're seeing in our numbers tends to sort of back up what you're seeing in some of the public numbers. So Arizona seems to be leaning Senate race towards the Democratic candidate. Montana is leaning away from the Democratic candidate, and just for not sure how much everyone's living and breathing politics who's on the call, right? But West Virginia is pretty much a guaranteed loss for Democrats, with Manchin stepping down. So then, that puts the Senate at 51-49. If everyone else won re-election, and then, Tefter's has a very tough race in Montana. So then that would put it down to the 50-50. There's not, and then Ohio seems to be, again, it's Ohio. It's a pretty red state. But Sherrod Brown is seemingly in a good position to win re-election, probably close. Florida could be interesting on the Democratic side, but not hanging our hat on like, oh, like total upset in the making here. But I think that's going to be one of those like closer than expected type of races. We're not doing anything in Texas, unfortunately, although in public polling, it sounds like, Cruz is holding on to a slim majority, or barely a majority, or a slim lead, I should say, by like 3 or 4 points. So, Senate tough for Democrats, to be sure. On the House, I mean, it's so narrow, and with the numbers that Andrew was going through, it totally could go either way. But I mean, I think the only thing I would arguably rule out is a landslide in either direction doesn't feel likely. And then the only other thing I'll sort of point out on sort of because I mean, there's definitely been a good amount of talk about like polling underestimating Trump's support, which certainly true. I think there's some questionable things going on with some of the public polling on weighting the data back to 2020, which I don't know if that's necessarily the best approach. I kind of understand why people are doing it, but it could be throwing some numbers off slightly. And then certainly 2022 underestimated Democratic support. So I think there is less likelihood of the quote unquote silent Trump supporter in research, and I think there's a higher likelihood of female, especially women voters, sort of either not participating or not expressing opinions, as similar to what we saw in 2020, since abortion is so front and center on this one. So if I'm betting on anything, it's a slight undercount for Democratic support than Republican support, but we'll know how that looks in about 3 weeks.
Yep, only a couple weeks left. Great, thank you. And I know we had one more question about, asking if we're going to put any more data out ahead of November 5. Yes, we're always putting data out, mostly through our newsletter, our Political Trend Watch. So I've dropped the link in the chat to sign up for that. That comes out semi-regularly, and we'll definitely update these numbers ahead of Election Day. With that, I think we've answered all of the questions that we have. Stefan, Andrew, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Andrew, anything?
Nope, just things are uncertain, that's for sure.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I just want to thank everyone for joining. Like Sam said, we'll send out a copy of the recording to everyone who signed up, who was here. We'll also put in links for the newsletters. If you want to sign up, great, really appreciate it. And you obviously, I would think, would know how to reach us. So if any questions come up or we didn't answer your question, I think we got to everything. But if we didn't, shoot us a note. Always happy to chat data, and really appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.